Our first session of the day is Procurement and Ethics, a History, presented by Mr. Greg Tolbert, Legal Services Manager with the Washington State Department of Enterprise Services in the state of Washington. This session will count for 1 hour of ethics credit if your state is reasonable at all with their guidelines. So please welcome to the stage Mr. Greg Tolbert.
Thank you, Megan. Megan did meet with me early this morning because of all the 1Ls here. She's so very proud of them in the legal education program, but she wanted to remind me of the custom that, in addition to the app, if you've got a question or a comment, just pull out your drink ticket, write it on the back of that, and hand it to me at the break. I've been to most of the NASPO Law Institutes, I think 10 of them, and these are the single best opportunity for lawyers and chief procurement officers to understand some of the complex issues that impact procurement across the state. I invest my time in these because I think I get a lot more out of them. You get to network with people who understand these issues, and if you have a problem in the future, you can reach out to those folks. In addition, it gives you the opportunity to see materials from people that have struggled with these issues. So with that in mind, let's get going. I first want to thank NASPO for letting myself and my coworker, Angie McLean, attend this presentation. So on behalf of the Washington Department of Enterprise Services, we are delighted to be here. Megan also told me that I'd be speaking to a bunch of lawyers, so I wanted to make sure that I had a tie for that, so that explains that. We're going to highlight here what we're going to do in this presentation. We'll tackle the agenda, identify what's included in the materials, and then have some goals. So first, in terms of goals, the NASPO team had a great list of goals, and I'm hoping that ours, much more modest, match up to that. But I want to create awareness regarding procurement integrity, provide a potential framework for you and your counterparts at the chief procurement officers to think about these issues, share some common sense, practical solutions that you can take back home, identify how you can work to support the procurement officials, and provide some additional resources so that you can go out and do research on your own. So what's included? First, you get this lengthy presentation, and there's a link to it in the session description. And it's designed to be comprehensive, right? So that means it's long. I tried to pack in resources with hyperlinks so that you could use it if these issues come up. In addition, we have takeaway messages at the end that try to summarize these things and additional resources. Now, the AI is going to summarize what I talk about, but I am not going to read all these slides. You're grown adults. You can read the slides if you're interested as we go. In addition, we have the supplemental materials that are going to be included. Those are listed as additional resources. These are just templates that at our agency we use to try to deal with some of the procurement integrity issues. So you'll find that there's a bidder certification there. It's pretty lengthy, but it has a lot of the common procurement integrity certifications that you'd want your suppliers to commit to and then put in as reps and warranties in the contracts. We also use procurement integrity certifications under penalty of perjury, right? And if people balk about signing that, well, maybe they're not the right people to be your protest officer or your evaluator or the person developing the specifications, because those are designed to do two things: hold them accountable, but also remind them of these procurement integrity issues that they're going to have to be mindful of when they're doing their jobs. We included a copy of our template for the competitive solicitation because it has in there the evaluation process that we go through. Because if you're a bidder, maybe you're a little skeptical that you're going to get a fair deal from the state. And so we wanted to make sure that it's right there in black and white so that people could understand how these bids are going to be evaluated. If they have a problem with that, they can raise a complaint, file a protest, or ask a question. And finally, we have, I think what is probably a novel tool. We developed a bidder contracting guide. It's lengthy, but it's designed to do two things. First, shorten our competitive solicitation by moving some of the content to another document, but it tells people how they can file a complaint, the protest, all the unique aspects of doing business with the state of Washington. But importantly, it is also a procurement integrity tool, both for bidders as well as for our procurement staff. It tells them very clearly what contract provisions that we have included in that contract that we're simply not going to negotiate or take out because there's a state statute or a rule or something there. But we provide an explanation as to why that's there so that they think, oh, okay, that makes sense. I'm getting a square deal. Secondly, we tell them terms that we're not going to entertain a discussion about. So don't waste your time sending us that we have to indemnify you as a supplier because that's just not going to happen. And we explain why so that they, again, have trust in the process. The other thing that it does is it creates a level playing field, right? Small businesses, big businesses, they can understand that everybody's going to be treated the same. You are going to get a square deal. So that's our approach. We implemented it last January. We have not had pushback from the bidder community since then. And I think we've had less transactional waste of time negotiating provisions that simply shouldn't be negotiated, or worse yet, that somebody actually does put into a contract. These are things that we're hopeful that you're going to learn today, but you probably already suspected. It's probably not new information for experienced procurement officers or their attorneys. It does, however, summarize this presentation and provide a concise reminder of the procurement officers and the council with their procurement integrity challenges that are coming their way. So we'll see if AI comes up with the same list. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Finally, the agenda, right? Experts have done studies. Smart people, I'm told, think in groups of 3 when they do their presentations. It makes the communication easier, the people can remember it. You might be familiar with some of this research. It led to things like stop, drop, roll, 911, hold my beer. So for those who might not be able to see the agenda, here's my 3-point agenda. Not to worry, we're not going to spend much time on the takeaway messages at the end because they're summarized right there and you can read them. And we won't talk about the additional resources. Those are just links to tools. But we will zip through the rest of it in a pretty quick clip. We'll start with some table setting. We'll have a quick level summary of the state procurement. Then to better appreciate the nuances of public procurement integrity issues, we'll take a romp through some of the historical abuses that have led us to where we are. And then finally, we'll revisit the state procurement process. We'll identify some common procurement integrity issues, and we'll identify some common practical solutions. Now, most of you are younger than me, so just in case, I'm going to begin with a trigger warning. I'm not sure why the youngsters were so scared of horses. This Trigger here, he got the bad end of the deal. He ended up as a stuffed taxidermy exhibit down in Branson, Missouri. But I digress. This is going to be a Clutch Your Pearls presentation. But we're all adults, so we're going to speak the truth. You will leave knowing that government employees are human beings. And some are greedy and not free from the lure of easy money. You'll also hear, and hopefully this is not a surprise, that the public expects a lot better. As legal counsel, part of your job is to be mindful of these procurement integrity risks and provide appropriate counsel, to help build support and awareness for education, to be a part of a culture that empowers team members to speak up if they see issues. Do not assume that your organization is immune to the procurement integrity issues that we'll talk about today. Before we get started, public procurement is a challenge. Occasionally, it can be a dumpster fire. Most public procurement professionals, they seek clarity, they color in the lines, they turn square corners. Some don't. These outliers stain all of us. Their actions and their consequences are frequently very highly visible. They can cause intense public outrage, resulting in even more increasingly complex and challenging procurement environments. Meet Georgia citizen Adam L. Smith, not to be confused with the Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith. He served as the City of Atlanta's Chief Procurement Officer from 2003 to February 21, 2017, when, following a federal investigation into a pay-for-play scheme for city contracts, the FBI escorted him out of his office. They seized his computer. They grabbed his office records. Prior to that perp walk, Smith oversaw billions of dollars of public contracts. the city issued this statement. The City of Atlanta announced today that Adam Smith, Chief Procurement Officer, has been relieved of his duties effective immediately. No mention of the corruption. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, they said this. He graduated from Morehouse, Yale, and Georgetown Law, so we can stipulate he's no dummy. Crooked, yes, but not stupid. Smith pleaded guilty to conspiring to accept more than $40,000 in bribes payments from a vendor who ended up getting millions of dollars of public contracts. Smith was ultimately sentenced to 2 years and 3 months, ordered to pay $44,000 fine, and then restitution. Contractors who conspired with him, they of course also were in trouble, but they turned and started recording his conversations. Meet convicted felon and former Chicago Public School District CEO Barbara Bird Byratt. She was involved in a multi-year bribery scheme to divert millions of dollars in contracts to her former employer. Prosecutors wrote this about her. Her own attorneys said she went deaf and blind to the wrong she was committing by not removing herself from the ongoing scheme or distancing herself from her former employer. They admit in her sentencing memo that she, quote, harbored a very real and greedy sense of entitlement. She ultimately pled guilty and was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. And finally, meet convicted felon John Bills, formerly second in command at Chicago Department of Transportation. He was sentenced to 10 years. A jury found him guilty of accepting up to $2 million in cash and gifts to steer contracts to the city's red light camera vendor. During trial, prosecutors said he received hotel rooms, golf trips, a condo in Arizona, an apartment on the south side, a Mercedes, $600,000 in cash for steering the contracts. He explained what happened. It was just me, a regular guy, placed in a tough position, and I made some tremendous ethical mistakes. U.S. District Judge Virginia Kendall had a different perspective, and when she sentenced him to 10 years, there's lots of examples. They occur every day. The problem, of course, is that as public sector employees, the public has their eye on us. We operate under public microscope, often with after-action clarity in a society increasingly ruled by social media mobs. This is a fragile community license to operate. At a minimum, the public procurement requires that as the marketplace will trust us in the process and that the public has confidence that the people administering the process will do it fairly. So before we go any further, on behalf of all the hardworking, square-turning public procurement professionals here today, thank you for your service. Procurement integrity, ultimately, a person's character has it or they don't. This is kind of a good news, bad news situation. The good news here is that most procurement professionals do have integrity, and this presentation simply reminds them why. But it also increases focuses on the separate issues of the procurement process and potential risks. The bad news is that for those who have developed habits, this session likely won't make a difference unless it helps steel your courage to enforce procurement integrity solutions. President Reagan eloquently noted the basis of character integrity and what it takes to make good decisions as a procurement professional. He was not speaking about legends or mythic figures. He was talking about the common man, as he often did, and that they often do not rise to the occasion. Instead, most people fall into habits, thoughts, behaviors, and actions where they're comfortable. That's why seemingly unimportant decisions are the building blocks of character, for good or for bad. It's good to remind ourselves that human beings have the reason we admire these characteristics like truthfulness, resistance to injustice, that they are admirable is because few people really have these. Many of us may assume that we had been the first to stand up to the Nazis or that we're the same as Washington or Lincoln, but the reality is that many of us simply aren't. We don't rise up to that occasion. We fool ourselves. And that's why it's important that just in our daily life, we don't round the corners, we follow the process, and why we end up with a procurement integrity presentation. Before diving into procurement integrity issues and solutions, it's helpful to understand the context for procurement integrity, the public marketplace expectations pertaining to state procurements, as well as the outside influences that also impact the procurement function. This information, remedial for many of you, does intertwine and inform procurement integrity issues. In the old days, there were guys who could simplify this stuff. Detective Joe Friday. He would say something like, just the facts. In that case, procurement integrity issues ultimately revolve around 3 facts that should not be news to anyone. Generally speaking, the government does not make anything. It doesn't produce goods. It doesn't provide services in the effect of what our agencies want. Accordingly, every year, state and local procurement agencies need to procure the goods and services to carry out their function. This involves spending billions of dollars of other people's money. And then public procurement is one of the government's activities that is most vulnerable to corruption. So first, state procurement of goods and services is an operational and transactional necessity. State agencies typically do not produce goods or services. They have to buy them. This means that goods and services must be purchased from the outside through a procurement process designed to do 2 things: promote fair and open competition and minimize procurement integrity risks. Courts agree with this. Those are the 2 goals of the procurement process: get goods and services at a fair price and minimize risks to procurement corruption. Second, the state spends enormous sums of money. There's no readily identifiable figure because each state does it differently. Why wouldn't they? But according to the U.S. Bureau of Census, their survey of state and local government finance from 1977 to 2021, state and local governments spent $3.7 trillion in fiscal year 2021. For a reference of how much money that is, there's only 4 countries on earth that have a GDP bigger than that. And for states, 1 out of every $3 is spent to purchase something, whether it's photocopier ink or fleet vehicles. Because states spend huge sums of taxpayer money on procurements, the public has certain expectations about that state procurement. This has been true since colonial times. Thomas Paine, he was kind of the Parks and Recreation's Ron Swanson of his day, only he had a quill rather than woodworking tools, noted this in his 47-page document, Common Sense, which, by the way, is the most, proportionately, the most highly read publication in America. There are several reasons why taxpayers expect efficient, effective, and accountable government, but let's just focus on 2. First, as we reduce liberty in exchange for government, we expect a fair amount of accountability. Second, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman was right. There's no free lunch. Instead, government operates on taxpayer money. Accordingly, we expect government activities to be efficient. We don't want fraud, waste, abuse, or corruption. If your neighbor spends her paycheck buying something useless, we don't really care. But when the government blows your money, that's ridiculous, and the public simply doesn't want to stand for it. Third, with so much money changing hands, few government activities create greater temptation or offer more opportunities for corruption than public procurement. In addition to the huge volume of transactions and the financial interest at stake, corruption risks are exacerbated by a complex process and the often close interaction between the bidders and awarded contractors and the procurement staff, and the multitude of stakeholders involved. As a result, the procurement function is one of the single functions that has the greatest opportunity for government employees to use government resources for their own personal interest. Problematically, however, the public expects that employees that are using procurement system to reward themselves, their friends, or their supporters, that it poisons the public confidence in the procurement process, and it cripples the ability of good public servants to find reputable vendors that want to deal with that agency. As we'll see later, State procurement faces both external threats and internal threats. When I say external, I mean unscrupulous vendors. And when I say internal, I mean, now no offense, but let's be real. It may be your coworkers. It might even be, well, you know. People who study procurement corruption will say that determining the amount of corruption, money lost, is very difficult. First, there's a couple of reasons. Unlike if you have an auto theft where your car is stolen off the street and you file an insurance claim, that's tracked. The procurement corruption goes unchecked. There's no filing a report, and many agencies are incentivized not to publicize those failures. That said, there's some estimates. Globally, the United Nations estimates 10 to 20% of public contracting is lost to corruption. In the US, for fiscal years 2018 to 2022, the Government Accountability Office estimated that the federal government lost between $233 and $521 billion. We'll get to the state figure later on. The result is that in significant measure, because of these three facts that we discussed, most state procurement codes, whether based on the model procurement code or otherwise, codify certain public expectations that are designed primarily to promote procurement integrity. To reiterate the obvious, these are public expectations, and they are designed primarily to promote procurement integrity. Procurement integrity, in essence, refers to the adherence to honesty, fairness, transparency, objectivity, and ethical conduct in the public procurement process to acquire goods and services. It involves preventing conflicts of interest, fraud, improper influence by ensuring that procurement officials and vendors follow strict requirements. The procurement integrity traction that drives the procurement code is based on just a handful of pretty obvious things. Having a bias for competition, having a process that's fair, it's open, it's impartial, transparent to everyone, and accountable. As an economic matter, certain of these public expectations also benefit the state as taxpayers. For example, competition. If you have a robust market where buyers have to compete, encourages competition, it does two things. First, it creates economic value because you lower entry barriers to new firms. You don't have monopolies getting the contract over and over, and it leads to innovation. Second, it keeps markets honest. Without competition, if you have no bid contracts, you have no incentive to lower the price, improve the quality, or even innovate. The transparency and the openness also benefits because you can see the actual figures and see that the government agency is being effective in using your dollars. And it helps ensure the effective use of those funds. Why emphasize procurement integrity? We set this question up at the beginning. There are two reasons. First, it's the right thing to do, right? Both public confidence and market trust in government is based in significant measure on the government turning square corners, which means that you act in fairness, objective, everybody has a chance at getting the procurement. In other words, now attorneys take note, the government should not play games, not even word games to justify questionable actions. That erodes both the public confidence and the market trust. And if you do not have that, you lose the good vendors who would compete for the state's business. It enables the government to also achieve its objectives more efficiently. This slide, I'm hopeful, reinforces fundamental expectations for procurement counsel and procurement officers. Short-term advantage of rounding the corners may be achieved, but these practices ultimately compromise the state's ability to achieve its procurement goals. And as President Reagan noted, when you start compromising these procurement integrity requirements, it becomes a habit, it becomes your character. So let's pause and state the obvious. To achieve the economic benefits that the state and public that we just discussed, certain critical facts have to exist. There has to be both public confidence in the procurement professionals, and the vendors must trust the process. If the procurement code or its administration is not trusted, procurement objectives cannot be achieved efficiently. States could, of course, still get the goods and services that they want, but the consequences of a dysfunctional market means that you are going to have higher cost, lesser quality goods, and more expense to the state. So for the folks here who may need to promote procurement integrity back at the office, you may be able to get people to listen if you talk about this slide, that without procurement integrity, you probably don't need a very large procurement office, right? You can just hand out the contracts, but you're very likely to need a huge supplemental budget increase. At this point, let's try to be a tad less dreary and summarize where we are. 3 statements. First, procurement integrity is a code phrase that smarter people than me could fill with several slides defining it. But it can be simplified for a hillbilly like me. Procurement integrity is a set of standards, behaviors, practices informed by a commitment to open, fair, competitive, transparent procurement principles where the procurement decisions are impartial and based on applicable law and objective facts. That should not be news. And on the other hand, the procurement process, it's based on 2 things, is about the applicable law, whether you have a code, regulations, policies, court decisions. Foundationally, it does the procurement comport with procurement integrity. Here's a spoiler. Generally speaking, the problem is not the process. It's usually clear, it's written down on paper. The problem is the administration of that process, which is the procurement operations. Oops. Yeah. In administering the process, are the government officials, are they performed in a manner that is a high procurement integrity environment? These 2 overlapping categories of standards, behaviors, and practices are designed to do things: reduce corruption and maintain public confidence and vendor trust in the state procurement process. Now, you might be thinking like me, if the procurement code is this easy, how can it be difficult? The problem is that it's impacted by a lot of other factors. First, procurement politics. Here I'm talking about where the governor or the legislature uses the procurement code to implement certain procurement objectives. These impact and transform the marketplace. For example, various product preferences that may advantage certain vendors, vendor preferences, which obviously advantage some vendors over others, or socioeconomic preferences, wage theft or things like that. There's also rent-seeking behavior. Oh, why wouldn't there be? This is where firms lobby so that they don't have to create any economic value. They just disadvantage their competitors and they get their preferences. There's stakeholder intervention, and this can come from a lot of sources. The procurement agencies authorize an environment, whether it's a legislator or someone in the governor's office. It could come from other procurement agencies within the state that work with the central authority, advocacy groups that want the contracts for their members but not other people, and then connected vendors who want, quote, their contract. There's also the purchaser needs. And here what we're talking about is the realities of procurement. Sometimes it's small purchases, no bid contracts, emergency purchases, again, often no bid contracts, or suboptimal planning, where you're in a rush because you need these goods and services to perform the state's function, but haven't done it yet. So growing up, I suspect we all encountered people like this. Then many of us went to law school, and then we're surrounded by people reading the rule books. It's the nature of the legal profession, an intense focus on process and compliance. But let's be honest, there's a lot of gray areas there that permit either higher procurement integrity actions or may excuse behavior in the interest of expediency. So let's pause at a moment and appreciate what we just heard. A couple of important points. The legal counsel and the procurement authority have different roles. The procurement authority, not the legal counsel, they're responsible for making the operational decisions and administering the procurement code. In the event of procurement corruption, the legal counsel is probably going to get involved, but it's the operational team that are going to find their schedules suddenly populated with a lot of difficult meetings. The legal counsel, by contrast, provides the procurement authority with options-based value-added solutions that are based on high procurement integrity implementation of these requirements. The legal counsel, however, they're not a potted plant. I mean, if you see corruption, there's a lot of things that you can do. Just a warning for the lawyers, this slide may be shocking. For folks who have not practiced law in the law firm, or better yet, for a commercial entity where you had to make money to make the paychecks, you may assume that the legal function is the whole thing. Frequently, the legal issue is only a small component of the issue before the procurement authority. So what does this mean? Every client that utilizes a lawyer, including procurement authorities, they want solutions, options-based, value-added professional legal advice pertaining to their issue, lawful solutions, preferably more than one, right? They provide a risk-adjusted range of options to inform the operational or business decision. Sometimes these solutions are difficult for the procurement authority to hear, like, you'll need to redo this procurement. But that's the path of high-integrity procurement professionals. Often needs more meat on the bone for these things. This seems to be common sense, commonly not done. For example, if you're new to state procurement, you're going to discover that the law school did not teach you much of anything about state procurement law. So you're going to want to do some research. You're going to have to crack some books. What I did is I came to these presentations here because I learned a lot, and you can network with professionals who actually know this stuff. But in addition, you're going to act with operational professionals that are just new to procurement. They've never done it before, but now they're a director of an agency. Part of your job as legal counsel is to provide them an operational framework informed by legal authority so that crazy things don't start happening in the procurement process. Now, in providing legal counsel, it's important to be mindful of the foundational bases that we've discussed here, because these encourage robust competition, but they're often, ignored. Failing to meet these procurement integrity expectations is going to be a problem. Public employees, you can be fired. Some of this stuff will rise to the level of criminal prosecution. These stories are not infrequently highly publicized, makes a good bedtime story. It's clickbait for people. The behavior that violates this stuff often leads to criminal charges. Your morning coffee turns into this. Folks with badges, guns, sunglasses showing up. And your afternoon turns into this. You're left thinking, I wish I was one of those Silicon Valley venture capitalists who wear a hoodie and I could hide up. I'd also add shame. My daughter, however, recently graduated from college. I learned about this thing called TikTok. So in 2025, I think shame might be dead. This section, I hope, will provide a context for some of the reasons why we have the procurement code today and some of the challenges that we confront. We'll take a quick romp through this. The procurement is an essential external and internal compliance strategy. The modern procurement code is based on foundational drivers that we've identified: fairness, transparency, competition. But to do this, Americans do not rely on good intent. Instead, we have more regulations every time there's a scandal. Every time an agency gets caught, it has to redo its process, add more policies. And our nation has a checkered history with procurement ethics, as we'll find out. The cycle of corruption and abuse, it just continues for contractors as well as the public employees. This slide is to convince you that, I put some thought into this presentation, and more importantly that, it looks like there might be an end. So let's go back 5,000 years to the Egypt and their first dynasty. The good news here is that the procurement professionals, it's a pyramid scheme, of course. So Ice Cube has it right. You want to be on top of that pyramid scheme, not on the bottom of it. But back to ancient Egypt. The pharaoh's on top, but look who's next. It's your chief procurement officer, right there at the second level. Sadly, for attorneys, we're a couple of pegs down on the social hierarchy, but the good news is we're still above the peasants. Go forward 2,500 years, right? It's 1066. The French nobleman and a Viking descendant, William the Conqueror, leads the Norman conquest and defeats the English king at the Battle of Hastings. He installs himself as king, and we have feudalism for the next 3 centuries. This is the dominant social system in Europe. Spoiler alert, if you live there, you want to be on top, as Ice Cube says, not on the bottom. With this pyramid scheme in mind, how do you get rich if you're born at the bottom? You go to work for the government. Meet Samuel Pepys. Now, people will tell you, you can be a historical figure, or you can write the history down. That's the only way you're going to be remembered. He did the latter. He's the son of a tailor. He's not positioned well, right? In the class system, he's down on the bottom rung. He's best known for his diaries. This guy wrote daily entries for 10 years, beginning in 1660. So he covers the plague of 1665, the Great London Fire of 1666. Now, what's his link to state procurement? He used his connections to get himself a position as the clerk of the Royal Navy. It's equivalent to a modern procurement professional. No maritime experience whatsoever. But he rose to be chief secretary of the Admiralty under both King Charles II and King James II through patronage, diligence, and his talent for administration. It's an unpaid position. But he soon becomes very, very wealthy from the kickbacks that he's receiving from all the contractors. At the time, there's nothing illegal about this. It's the way business gets done. It's the expected method for procuring contracts. So for people that have no nobility, no connection, they're on the bottom rung, what do? It's a boat ride. So in 1607, English venture capitalists get in a boat and they establish the first English settlement in North America. Today, it's just down the road from the college of our alma mater, the College of William and Mary. 13 years later, the Mayflower lands in Plymouth. Now, these are English separatists. We now call them pilgrims, but they wanted to establish their independence from the Church of England, which they thought was corrupt. They opposed the monarchs, so William Bradford and a group get in a boat. They also head to Virginia. They have a storm, they hit what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts. They brought with them some snappy clothing, as well as 2 things: the English common law and the English system of military procurement. That is, that the field army is responsible for procuring its supplies locally. There's no central contracting authority to do this for them. Now, spoiler, the countryside in 1620 did not include the Walmarts or the Costcos, so as we'll see, procurement is going to be a challenge and there's going to be some issues. Now, 21st century hipsters, they would love this local sourcing, right? You can get fancy goods at higher prices, but back in 1620, not so much. 150 years later, the English colonies, they're rough and tumble. Some folks loyal to the king, some are the revolutionaries. Colonial America, of course, is much different than America today. Most of the population is populated on the East Coast along the King's Way, which became post roads. You'll see those all over America from Georgia to Maine. Those also were a contracting scandal. There are lots of government contracting scandals. Benjamin Franklin, of course, he's ranting against the smugglers, very common problem back in his day. Meanwhile, England is emptying its jails. They're sending my ancestors over here to improve the well-peopling of the colonies. Franklin gets so annoyed, he wants to ship rattlesnakes back to the king. But back to procurement. The colonists are still using the English procurement system, and this approach ripe for corruption. So the Continental Congress, they get together, 13 colonies, of course. It's a hot mess. The colonies don't want a strong central government. They've had their fill with the king. They're running everything by committee. I know, it's not optimized for procurement. It also makes it extremely difficult to get the goods and services that they need for their new nation. So the Continental Congress has a way. They find a way to supply the troops, because you can't have troops with an empty stomach and no guns and no ammo. This is the committee approach to procurement. This is the first solicitation in American history. It's an RFP for troops to supply 2 battalions who were recruited in New Jersey. It is quite a bit shorter than our procurements and probably than yours. I've got news. The procurement committee approach doesn't work. So the Continental Congress, and a hint of the political micromanagement that's coming, starts using purchasing agents. These jobs, highly sought after. They're appointed by the Congress, and these guys, they're not military men. They know nothing about the military needs. They're simply businessmen. Congress thought this would result in an effective acquisition process. The agents were paid a commission based on the contracts. Now, as Scooby-Doo would say, ruh-roh, most of these agents, they're honest. Some, again, are not. Problematically, however, this commission incentive means that the agent didn't care about the goods that they're buying. They just care about how much the price is. Nepotism, favoritism, these are the common means of awarding these contracts. They regularly gave inside information to their preferred vendors. I mean, why wouldn't they? They just wanted to get that commission as a purchasing agent. So in the American Revolution, this becomes a problem, right? We have significant procurement fraud, but again, Washington out there trying to run a revolution against the most powerful military on earth. This disorganization and mismanagement from the procurement process, think no efficiency, no real accountability, causes the debacles of starvation amongst plenty. There was plenty of food in that area at Valley Forge and then again at Morristown. But it's insipid part because the government, the revolutionaries, are a procurement risk, right? The local farmers, do I want this Continental Congress paper money or do I want the British silver? Many of them preferred the British silver rather than a promise to be paid in the future. 200 years later, we still have the same issue with vendors wanting to get advance payments. After the war, the government's reorganized. Now we have 3 departments: Treasury, Marine, and War. Congress appoints Robert Morris. He's a wealthy Philadelphia banker. He ended up poor after some land schemes, but at the time, very wealthy. He refuses the job initially, but he ultimately accepts it. One condition: he gets to keep his private business. Congress is reluctant for all the obvious reasons. Morris's legacy is mixed. Some thought he was a profiteer. Others thought he was using his business in a clandestine effort to help the revolutionaries. But regardless, he greatly improved public procurement. He did a few things. He overhauled the contract system. He instituted bids. There would be timelines. The bids would be open, negotiated. And he's the guy who required responsible bidders, the modern equivalent of the qualification system. Contractors had to be, quote, men of substance and talent. And he required the terms to be, quote, most beneficial to the public. Corruption's still a problem, but this is a huge improvement. Now we're at the early 1880s. We're still debating how government supplies the goods and services it needs. It's a policy debate. Do you make them or do you buy them? At the outbreak of the War of 1812, Calendar Irvine, he's appointed as the Commissary General of Purchases. He's the guy there on the left with the fancy boots. He had a reputation for very demanding specifications. You may have seen this guy in some of your stakeholder teams. He did not like contractors. He is famous for 2 quotes. He thought all these contractors were crooked and greedy, and he wanted the goods to be made rather than bought. The result is, you have the War of 1812, and the U.S. government, they're perceived as just too difficult to work with. For example, Calendar Irvine, he's having a feud with Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, but he also invented some muskets that had interchangeable parts, field assembly, mass production, could use them a lot better. But Irvine, he kept canceling those contracts, which he often did, and finally, Eli Whitney had to go over his head to President Madison and get his contract. Civil War. Confederates led by General Beauregard, bombarded the Union soldiers at Fort Sumter in South Carolina in 1861. Thereafter, both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, they have to raise, organize, supply an army very quickly to get things going. The bloodshed here is enormous, right? Approximately 620,000 Americans die. Over half of all of U.S. casualties in war to date. Huge. The Civil War also covers an enormous area. And think about it. You have to provide goods and services for troops that are moving over that enormous area. without interstate highways, without trucks, planes, things of that nature. Sadly, fraud, profiteering, those are the hallmarks of this government business during the Civil War. And it's because you have hasty mobilization, loose enforcement, and large-scale, what are in fact emergency buys. Shockingly, it's the government employees themselves who cause a lot of the procurement abuse. The result is chaos and corruption. You have horse inspectors in Washington, D.C. that endorse the purchases of lame animals in exchange for bribes. You had clothing inspectors in Pennsylvania that approved vast piles of rotten stuff that would later have to be condemned. You had procurement officials that bought useless straw hats and pantaloons at exorbitant prices for soldiers. The procurement officials would buy goods, they would mark them up again, and then sell them to the government. And then the contractors themselves, they double billed for forage, or the deals are awarded without competition. By August, we're 4 months into the war, and the union is millions of dollars in debt. Worse yet, much of the spending on the goods and services did little to help where it mattered most in the fight against the rebels. The procurement abuse is so bad, we end up with new words. You've probably heard this phrase. We're not paying good money for shoddy goods. Shoddy was actually a product. It was this material made from scraps on the floor of the mills that they would hammer together and paste together and then sell it. It's so bad that when the soldiers are out in the field and it rains or it gets hot, it literally melts apart and sheds off their bodies. This product came to embody the fraud and the corruption that was occurring in the government contracting. So procurement, however, is the key ingredient as to why the union was successful. Meet Montgomery Meigs. Now, he's a Southerner. He's from Georgia right here. He's known as Lincoln's general. He was the quartermaster general for the U.S. Army during the Civil War. He had a reputation for being efficient, hard-driving, and scrupulously honest, which was viewed as a key factor by historians in the Union's success. The Confederacy never had enough supplies. They kept running out. The Union, however, even though they're moving across that vast expanse of America, the supplies, the ammunition, the food kept up with the troops. The Union supply system, it penetrated deeper and deeper into the South and maintained its efficiency. And historians credit this procurement as a key factor in the Union's success. So we have that going for us. Now, on the other hand, meet John C. Fremont. He's in the same army as General Meigs. He's in charge of the Western Department out in St. Louis. This headquarters was criticized at the time as a, quote, horde of pirates. Fremont had a lavish mansion that he rented at taxpayer expense. His associates made huge profits securing Army contracts without any competition whatsoever. As a result, after the Civil War, the nation was highly disgusted by the contracting practices and the government officials. In 1863, citing the endemic fraud that was taking place amongst the suppliers to the Union, Congress enacts the False Claims Act. This was known originally as Lincoln's Law. Now it's sometimes known as the Informer's Law. This is the federal law that allows qui tam actions and encourages people to report corruption. Flash forward to 1872, this is the railroad scandal. Here, they're using money and bribes. They bribed 15 powerful Washingtonians, including the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of the Treasury, 4 senators, the Speaker of the House. The scandal causes widespread distrust of government, the lack of public confidence. The good news is, despite all the corruption, the railroad gets completed. There they meet up in Promontory Point in 1869. And if you're like me and don't read much, you can just watch a movie to find it all out. Teapot Dome in 1921. This is a bribery incident. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Bacon Fall, leases Navy oil reserves at Teapot Dome here in Natrona County, Wyoming, and 2 other locations in California to private oil companies without competitive bidding. The leases become the subject of an intense scandal, so of course Senator Walsh gets involved, And Secretary Fall ends up being convicted of taking bribes from the oil company. He's the first U.S. cabinet member to go to prison. He received a $100,000 no-interest loan. Now, that's about $1.2 million in real dollars. He also received gifts totaling about $404,000, and that's about $5.3 million today. He attempted to keep his actions top secret, but soon his lifestyle changed, and people noticed, and that's how he fell apart. Before Teapot Dome, this was the biggest scandal in U.S. Before Watergate, this was the biggest scandal in U.S. history. Then we have World War II. The U.S. is very reluctant to enter the war. President Franklin tries to arouse popular support for spending the military in there and getting the nation fighting against the Axis powers. He coins the phrase, the arsenal of democracy. This was necessary because the U.S. simply not prepared for this event, much like COVID, right? We had a small army. It's 1/10 the size of the German and Japanese army. We lacked the necessary equipment, didn't have enough guns, boats, tanks, planes. So this necessitated a very quick military buildup. The U.S. mobilization's focused on getting these goods as fast as possible. We employ a lot of people. And critically, the spend on this goes from $9 billion to $95 billion in just 4 years. This changed government procurement. The companies that are providing all this military equipment, they're no longer required to bid for the contracts. Instead, because that process is too slow when you're in World War. Instead, the government signs these cost-plus agreements, which become a problem. Now, it's not illegal to make a buck, even during a war, selling weapons or supplies. Often the problem is that the government procurement process gets abused. There's bribes to get the contracts or to have no-bid contracts. This was the major impetus for the change of the law created by the Bethlehem Steel decision. There, the government was challenging a contract by Bethlehem Steel. They had spent $24 million on it, but the government thought the cost plus was too much. But the court agreed with Bethlehem Steel. So in response to that, Congress enacts the Renegotiation Act, which gives the government the power in these emergency times to renegotiate the terms and conditions of the contract to lower the price. 1978, Abscam. Now we're up to my generation. The deals get a little crazy. The dress code gets crazy. Here we have, in 1978, the FBI creates a sting to investigate theft, forgery, and stolen art. They employ Melvin Weinberger. Now, he's a convicted swindler and an international con artist, but he's also their informant, and his girlfriend, Evelyn Knight, to help plan and conduct the operation. Weinberg creates a fake company called Abdul Enterprises, in which the FBI employees posed as fictional sheiks who had millions of dollars to invest in the U.S. Now, when the forger he's under the investigation, he suggests to the fake sheiks that they could invest in the U.S. casinos and that licensing could be acquired for the proper bribe. So they try to do this. Each congressman who's approached would be given a large sum of money for these private immigration bills. The first political figure that they get involved in this phony investment scheme is the Camden, New Jersey mayor, Angelo Erecci. In exchange for monetary kickbacks, the mayor told the sheiks representatives that, quote, "I'll give you Atlantic City." He tried to recruit several government officials, and U.S. congressmen are willing to grant this political favor for bribes. And in 1981, 1 U.S. senator and 6 representatives are convicted of taking bribes. Senator Larry Pressler from South Dakota, he is the only one who refused to take a bribe, saying at the time, "Wait a minute, what you're suggesting may be illegal." He immediately reported it to the FBI. Hollywood, of course, makes a movie about this. Oops, sorry. In 1985, we flash forward. This is an FBI sting operation from 85 to 87 involving municipalities and their counties in New York State. An FBI agent poses as a vendor of steel products. He offers bribes and kickbacks to these officials. Now, importantly, in 105 out of 106 instances, these public officials take the bribes. The sole refusal comes from one official who thought the bribe offer just simply wasn't enough. He was later convicted as well. So in 86 to 94, we have Operation Ill Wind. Here's an operation where 90 defense contractors, consultants, and government officials are ultimately prosecuted, including a high-ranking Pentagon assistant secretary. The case resulted in a total of $622 million worth of fines, recoveries, restitution, and forfeitures. It began, as most of these cases do, when an honest civilian contract refused to take part in the procurement in the criminal activity and instead reported it to the FBI. The scandal leads Congress here to pass the 1988 Procurement Integrity Act, which regulates the pay that procurement officials can get when they leave the government service. In 1995, we have Operation Silver Shovel, and this is just another Chicago crime probe, but here they have John Christopher on the inside as an FBI mole. He records and takes audio tapes, 1,100 of these, and by the end, he's got all of these people on tape, government officials, taking bribes to steer these contracts. It ultimately totaled $2.2 million. In 1999, one of my favorites, Rhode Island, codenamed Plunder Dome, is an undercover operation. The investigation and subsequent conviction on federal criminal charges of a number of the city officials there, including Vincent Buddy Cianci, who ironically is the anti-corruption candidate. Now, he's indicted in 2001 on federal criminal charges of racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, witness tampering, mail fraud, and several other Providence city officials are also indicted. The judge in that case says, quote, "Clearly, there is a feeling in the city government in Providence that corruption is tolerated. In this mayor's 2 administrations, there has been more corruption in the city of Providence than in the history of the state." They, of course, wrote a book about it. They also made a podcast that's fascinating. 2000s, you have defense contracts with Darlene Drunian. She's a former U.S. contracting official, undersecretary for the Air Force. She was investigated originally in 1993. That was her first trip. In 2000, on at least her second trip to the well, she's also investigated. There, she is providing job references for her daughter and son-in-law who mysteriously got jobs. Following that criticism, she's doing this tanker supply deal where the government was going to lease 100 tankers from Boeing. They finally got criticism, so they only leased 20 and bought 80 because they could buy them cheaper than leasing. The problem was that she was giving inside information to Boeing, which resulted in them getting these contracts, getting these excess fees. She and the chief financial officer ultimately sentenced to prison. Lots of other examples. Duke Cunningham taking bribes to steer contracts. He's sentenced to prison. You have 21st century contract managers like Kerry Kahn. He's with the Corps of Engineers. He has a whole group on the inside, giving bribes to contractors and kickbacks on invoices. Fleeces the government of $39 million. He would not have been covered, but he was thinking about retirement because he did not want to get caught. But at the same time, he had all this accrued leave that he didn't want to lose. So he stays on the job, and that's how they catch him. 2017, Hurricane Katrina, they have a contract for emergency services there. Has a lot of unusual terms, including that you cannot audit the contract. Lots of public outrage about this. It just continues. Baltimore, one corrupt mayor after another. They just keep going. 2001, this is not the Varsity Blues, this is a different one. This is a procurement official trying to get his son into USC's grad school in exchange for steering a contract. Just keeps, Operation Fat Leonard. This is the biggest procurement scandal in the Navy history. This guy steers contracts for the U.S. Navy, including an aircraft carrier, to his maintenance businesses because he has all these Navy personnel on the inside willing to take his bribes, his cash, the prostitutes. Big contract controversy. He turns and immediately starts talking to the government so he can get a lower fee, gets home confinement because of his medical issues, but he's not crippled enough that he can't cut off the leg band and
flee to Cuba, then to Venezuela, and they arrest him trying to get on a flight to Russia. He is ultimately convicted, and so are many Navy personnel on this contract. The Jedi Water contract, right? We're trying to get an off-the-shelf COT solution. All the big players involved. Google drops out because their employees don't want to be seen like this. Trump gets involved. You have the feud between him and Amazon Bezos. Finally, the contract gets awarded, then it gets rescinded. Then the government finally says, oh, let's stop this mess. And surprise, surprise, the new contract is awarded to all of the players. It just keeps going on. Procurement, we're all familiar with the fraud, with unemployment insurance, the payment packages, but also for the procurement integrity issues. We have the DBE programs that the insiders say are rife with corruption because, again, you're decreasing competition and handing out contracts. And we have the ongoing corruption. So where are we today? The problem is that public corruption exists. We have approximately 20 million professionals in state and local procurement. 20 million. I mean, if even 1% is corrupt, it's a huge number. These political scientists, Nascu and Chulu, did a 32-year study, and they assume that 5.2% of the state and local spend is corrupt. So going back, you have this eroding public confidence, and now today you have people who just simply have lower and lower public confidence in their government officials. So the next section is the section that I warned you that is the common issues and practical solutions. These are things that are pretty much common sense. Don't get lost in the virtueness of ethics. Think about compliance. This is what the public expects, and as Procurement Council, this is what you have to advise your procurement officials. So that is how to think about it. Again, why to think about it? It's because of that public license to operate. If the public has no confidence in us, and if the market doesn't trust us, it leads for inefficiency and all sorts of abuse. The procurement corruption can come in lots of different places. It can come externally and internally, and it's all for the same reason. It's the lure of easy money and the idea that I can get away with it. Lots of ways it happens. The key thing is the consequences, right? When it does happen, there's the loss of trust, loss of confidence, prices go up, and we're all stained with this abuse. When you think about corruption, lots of ways to do it, but these are 4 buckets that kind of make sense. And if you go through these things, these are probably just useful reminders. The first is that you do not want to undermine competition, because that is always going to be a problem, and there's millions of ways that people can do it. The second is that, you do not want to have biased vendor selection. That is always a problem. Then the corrupt negotiations after the fact that move more money across the table to the other side. And then finally, these fraudulent payment schemes. This is where the opportunity is. There's always going to be the opportunity, but you can find it if you have like audits or if you have separated duties, segregation of those things. So the last section, and we won't go through this, is just the procurement process. Here we have in the materials that you can look at is just 6 different ways, that 6 different parts of it, and you can look at it and it's, here are the common issues, here's how it is done, and then these are just obvious procurement solutions. And these are good reminders that you can take back, have discussions with your procurement staff about how to implement these things so that you can reduce the temptation or even the appearance that there might be corruption. And then finally, each of these stages have these things, so you can go through them at your leisure. And then finally, we have the takeaway messages that you can just simply read at your convenience if you're interested. Again, if you're a seasoned professional in this, these are all things that are going to make sense to you. You've been through these things. You're going to have people that are corrupt. There's going to be warning signs. They're going to come to light. But there's these the consequences, and then here's the takeaway messages. These are the things that are obvious. And just take a moment to go through them, because when you're wrestling with these procurement challenges, these are things that can form the basis of a discussion with your procurement staff, as well as the other procurement attorneys that help this staff. At the end of the presentation, we've included a lot of resources where there's other information, so if you're interested in finding more about procurement integrity and corruption and potential tools, that is where you can look. If you have questions, again, they're drink tickets, but feel free to grab myself or my coworker, Angie. We're happy to talk about this. If you guys have better solutions than what we've talked about, those are things that we want to know because we have big ears and are always looking for good ideas. Thank you very much for having us here and your time and patience.